Greetings, Tibaneros. In the current issue of World Affairs magazine, put out by the Hoover Institution and long edited by the late Reaganites Ebron and Jean Kirkpatrick, we find this piece, Letter from Cuba to Embargo or Not, by contributing editor Michael J. Totten. I was so bemused by this article alone that I had to buy the whole issue, because it so well reflects the open hypocrisy of U.S. Cuba policy, why there was even a Cuban Revolution, and why it's lasted so long as it has, when it should have gone the way of the New World Order decades ago. He begins with a factual statement, to wit, aside from the Arab boycott against Israel, American sanctions against Cuba have lasted longer than any other embargo in the modern era. And this is virtually the only one to be found in 6.5 pages. Then he writes, the sanctions were imposed in stages in the early 1960s after Fidel Castro began economic warfare against the United States by nationalizing private U.S. property on the island. Excuse me, but nationalizing property within the sovereignty of another nation is not warfare of any kind under international law. The notion that a Caribbean island with the size and GDP of Tennessee could wage any kind of warfare against the dominant nuclear superpower of the West is completely ludicrous, but typical of the great imperial power that always presents itself as the world's greatest aggrieved victim. In fact, the U.S. at the time conceded the Cuban government's internationally recognized legal right to nationalize these properties under eminent domain for the public good. How else was the interstate highway system being built in the U.S.? But the U.S. government demanded swift market value compensation rather than the Cuban government's offer of national bonds based on their official tax rates which these interests had connived to absurdly low levels under the old regime. This was the most feasible option for Havana, other than raising taxes, which would have caused as much civil unrest from landowners, foreign investors, and the mafia as outright confiscation. This is also why in the U.S. public improvements are nearly always made at the expense of little folks and their homes and businesses. In an economic colony like Mariel, Cuba, this class-based mandate was not possible if it was serious about using its own resources for its own public good. Totten's argument is that the embargo has been a failure, just like communism itself. Again, this is ex post facto rationalizing. Both were quite successful at what they set out to do. The embargo was designed to quarantine Cuba and show the rest of Latin America what awaited it for defying the Colossus of the North. Communism successfully freed the revolution from what Castro and Che called the uncomfortable bonds of North America's imperial capitalism. In the seesaw of who's starving Cuba, Totten consistently blames Havana over Washington. He uses the example of soap. Offer a Cuban a bar of soap and supposedly watch him or her crumple in gratitude, Totten says. Anybody can make soap, but Cuba refuses to do so because it's run by rotten old men, so in fear of change they have to hog it all for themselves, whether the little people drown in their own stink or not. Will bypass the issue of his great compassion for the little people of his own country, as shown by the Reaganite economic norms still in power in the U.S., to note that soap, of course, is derived from animal fats. And even if the old Cuba was fatter, as Totten alleges, the truth is that the majority of Cubans did not have soap on demand, even under the neo-colonial market regime of the 1950s. These soft or consumer goods were notorious casualties of developmental socialism, but let's be honest and acknowledge that most Latin American nations today don't produce sufficient home quantities of such goods. The majority of their market is supplied by imports, and as usual wash down the social ladder based on the ability to pay. Of course, honesty isn't what this article is really about anyway. The decision to break off economic relations was made by Castro, Totten says, but it was the U.S. that made the first move by ordering U.S. refineries not to touch Soviet oil coming to Cuba, months before the sweeping business expropriations of 1960. Starving an import-dependent economy like Cuba's from energy supplies was very much an act of economic aggression. And it was the United States that broke off diplomatic relations in January 1961, while it was making plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion, another inconvenient fact nicely left unmentioned in this establishment account, which isn't unusual if you accept its fundamental premise that the U.S. is the victim of Cuban aggression. Communism always reverts to capitalism eventually, Totten pontificates. This ideological fillip nicely ignores that capitalism always eventually fails due to its own ungovernable greed, and time again must be bailed out or replaced by state intervention. This is a cycle of the market as historically unshakable as the rise and fall of commodity prices. Totten seriously argues that Cuban service personnel are examples of socialist failure because their meager stated income is augmented by tips. but he's obviously never worked in a restaurant. If what you tip your bartender is proof of the success of capitalism, it's more bankrupt than even TARP gives credit. Havana, he tells us, could again be the jewel of the Caribbean before its architecture and infrastructure crumble away in dusty neglect. This, too, is proof of socialist failure, but goddamn. He's obviously never set foot in any U.S. city with comparable 19th century architecture and infrastructure like Cleveland or Detroit or St. Louis, victims of capitalist collapse in the 1980s, excuse me, market restructuring, before the fall of the socialist bloc. The only neoliberal way out of this would be gentrification, forcing the slum dwellers out on their asses while their former dwellings are revamped and leased out to rich U.S. and European settlers, a recolonization where editors of American magazines can dwell in upscale enclaves detached from the neoliberal devastation of the national economy around them. In truth, there isn't one shortcoming of the Cuban economy that he gives, from hungry cattle to marginal people hunting after hard currency jobs, that isn't equally, and if not more, the case for the poor majority in the neoliberal paradises of Latin America, along with the traditional feudalism still entrenched in places like Peru or Guatemala. We're to ignore this and marvel at the success of free market Latin America, to admire it precisely because 80% of all its national income has been directed to its own 1% and the 1%ers of Wall Street. We're to forget also that these neoliberal regimes were established by strangling these societies a grand mal seizure of blood, from Chile to Central America, during the very era when the Kirkpatricks ran this magazine and endorsed nearly all of the regimes involved. And so now we come to the heart of the deception, as practiced by Washington and rationalized by Mr. Totten so succinctly. Again, we'll refer to his article verbatim when we find it. Yeah, here we go. Sanctions against Cuba would be lifted at once if the regime were to hold just one free election and adhere to the human rights norms in our hemisphere. Since that hasn't happened, only one conclusion is possible. Okay, we'll get back to that conclusion in a minute, but this is just a few sentences after he's just written this. Any decent person should want to see political liberalization alongside economic liberalization, but a limited amount of progress can be made without it. The Chinese Communist Party figured out how to do it. So obviously a free election is not the requisite for the embargo or lifting it, but being a contract workhouse, one or the other, for U.S. capital. He says as much when he adds this. Going full China, where Cuba produces a massive amount of merchandise for American consumers, is not an option if the embargo is not lifted first. He also reveals that the real reason for the embargo is to make the Communist Party of Cuba triumphant. Even this is not quite accurate. The embargo was decreed before the Cuban Communist Party became the ruling organ of state, or was even created. The goal was and is to destroy the revolution itself by economic strangulation or military force, or by assassination or fomenting civil war. They were all part of the same multi-tracked plan, designed originally to complement one another. It was enacted as punishment for Castro's defiance. If Castro suppresses dissent in Cuba, the U.S. has been the jailkeeper and executioner of dissent in the entire hemisphere. This raises an interesting and very accurate parallel, which I'm going to go into in Parte 2.